Today, the TMCC Library Open Genealogy Lab is proud to present Katie Potempa, from the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America Archives. Katie is the Archives Assistant for the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America Archives, where she helps researchers with genealogy and record requests, processing collections, and manages the Record Center. Prior to her role at the Archives, she worked in a variety of archives, museums, and libraries across central Illinois and the Chicagoland area. Katie has had a passion for genealogy and history since she was a little girl and enjoys helping others discover more about their families. In 2015, she earned her Bachelor of Arts in History and Religion from Illinois University. She also earned her Master's in Library and Information Science with a certification in Special Collections from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 2017. Today, she will be covering how to find Lutheran ancestor records for your family tree. She'll be covering genealogy resources available in the archives that'll help you trace your ancestors, and a brief overview of the archives and the history of Lutheranism in the U.S. You will learn what kinds of print and digital resources are available to you at the archives, as well as tips and tricks when researching your Lutheran. So please, let's all put our hands together and wait.
Well, hi, everyone. Thank you, Sue. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So like Sue said, my name's Katie Potempa. I'm the Archives Assistant here at the ELCA Archives. And among other responsibilities, I help genealogists, both hobbyists and professionals, with their research. So I'm very excited today to share a little bit about what we have with you. See if my slide will change. There we go. Okay. So a little bit about the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, or ELCA, as we say in short. It is one of the largest Christian denominations in the country, and it is the largest Lutheran church body in the U.S. It is not the only Lutheran church body in the U.S., which we'll talk about a little bit later. We have about 4 million members and nearly 10,000 congregations across the U.S., Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Our current presiding bishop is the Reverend Elizabeth Eaton, and she was just reelected for her second term of 6 years at the Churchwide Assembly back in August. And the Churchwide organization is located in what we call the Lutheran Center. It's essentially the headquarters of the ELCA. It's located in Chicago, just east of O'Hare Airport. So a little bit about the archives. We are not housed with the rest of the Churchwide organization. We're in a separate building located in Elk Grove Village, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago, just on the other side of the airport. So my apologies in advance if you hear some planes flying overhead. We're maybe about 5 to 10 minutes down the road from the airport. Like many other religious archives, we have a small staff of 3 people, so it's just 2 other archivists and myself here. And we have more than 11,000 linear feet in collection materials. We also have a reading room and a small library for on-site researchers, but most of our researchers are remote. Okay, so what we collect, we are the official archives repository for the ELCA Churchwide office in Chicago, and we collect any and all valuable records no longer needed in the day-to-day conduct of the church's administration. And we are also the main repository for the 3 immediate predecessors of the ELCA, the American Lutheran Church, or the TALC, the Lutheran Church in America, or the LCA, and the Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches, the AELC. So there's a lot of acronyms and there's a lot of names to keep track of, but those are the 3 immediate predecessors that kind of combined in the 1980s to form the ELCA as we know it today. And we also collect materials from their predecessors as well. So those collections make up the bulk of our genealogy resources that people can use. We also collect Lutheran deaconess records. We collect records for pastors and missionaries of the ELCA and its predecessor bodies. We also collect congregational histories. So we have over 500 document cases containing these, but they aren't for every single congregation. They aren't systematically collected. They're just what people have donated over the years. We also have congregational records on microfilm, which I'll discuss a little bit more later. And if you're curious about what else we collect, you are welcome to visit our website and see our collection development statement. So with all these collections, we meet the research needs of students and professors. They often contact us and are interested in the ELCA's role in larger U.S. history and global history. People looking for a copy of their own or someone else's baptism, confirmation, marriage, or death record. And then last but not least, genealogy requests. So we have a few resources available on our website that you can look at. The first is the ELCA family tree. So you'll see at the top there's the ELCA, and then right below that those are the three predecessor bodies that I just mentioned, and you can see it branches off pretty quickly, and there's lots of smaller Lutheran Church bodies that formed what the ELCA is today. There were many other Lutheran Church bodies, but these, we can't fit all of them onto the family tree, so this is what we have today. So this can actually be pretty helpful if you have an ancestor who is a Lutheran pastor. It's helpful to know if you know what time period they served during, and you can see possibly what Lutheran Church bodies were in existence at that time. Also available on our website is the list of ELCA regional archives. So the ELCA is split up into 9 regions. Each region covers several states. Excuse me. So the regional archives hold records of closed congregations and some active congregations within the records. Typically, the regional archives mostly hold records of closed congregations. Some regions have multiple archives that serve 1 or 2 specific states. So for example, there's Region 4, which has an archives for Arkansas and Oklahoma, 1 for Kansas and Missouri, 1 for Texas and Louisiana, and 1 for Nebraska. I think that's the exception to the rule, though. Usually there's 1 regional archives that serves probably about 6 or 7 states. So Nevada is in Region 2. Which serves Arizona, California, Colorado, Hawaii, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming, as well as Nevada. And I've included the contact information both on the slide here and on your handout. So if you are looking for records of a congregation that you know is closed, you can find the appropriate regional archives to contact on this list. But if you don't know if the congregation is closed, please feel free to contact us and we'd be happy to help. Please keep in mind most of the regional archivists only work part-time for the ELCA, so it may take a little while for them to get back to you. I'll go give a very brief history of Lutheranism in the United States. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the story of Martin Luther and his 95 Theses that he nailed to the door of a church on October 31st, 1517. But his original intent wasn't to reform the Roman Catholic Church. He was actually an Augustinian monk at the time. But he ended up sparking the Protestant Revolution. So by the end of the Reformation, Lutheranism in the U.S., or in what became the U.S., arrived around the early 1600s. And it became a state religion throughout Germany, the Baltics, and Scandinavia. So once Lutheranism arrived in the U.S., mostly German and Scandinavian Lutherans immigrated to North America, but the first Lutherans came from Holland as part of the Dutch West India Trading Company. So the majority of the first Lutherans settled in New Amsterdam on the island of Manhattan, which is present-day New York City. And most of the colonists in New Amsterdam were Reformed Protestant, and Lutherans were actually kind of barely tolerated at the time. But after the English took over in 1664, Lutherans gained religious liberty and were allowed to establish congregations after that. So, in another part of what would become the U.S., Swedish immigrants arrived in the Delaware Valley in 1638 and established congregations there. And Sweden had a Lutheran state church starting in 1527, lasting all the way up until 2000. So many Swedish immigrants, when they came to the U.S. or North America, remained Lutheran. Now, moving into the 1700s, thousands of German Lutherans moved to the Hudson River Valley and Pennsylvania. And in the years following, during the 18th and early 19th centuries, many of these people and their descendants moved into what was considered the Northwest Territory, now kind of Ohio and the eastern half of the Midwest. And they moved to find better land inland. So these early immigrants from Germany and Scandinavia came to America mostly for economic reasons. German immigrants were typically poor, mostly farmers, with the exception being in Ebenezer, Georgia, which was founded in 1734 by Lutherans who were actually exiled for their faith in Salzburg, Germany. So that is kind of the one exception to that rule. So Lutheran immigrants during this time period founded congregations in the middle colonies, and as time progressed and with further immigration to North America, Lutherans expanded westward and settled largely in the Midwest. Lutherans formed regional and national denominations based on several factors, including geography, ethnicity, and theological differences, which I'll touch a little bit on later. And because of this reason, in 1748, the Ministerium of Pennsylvania was organized by Heinrich Muhlenberg, and he was attempting to unite geographically scattered Lutherans into a single body. So that was kind of the start of forming these Lutheran church bodies in the U.S. Okay, moving right along into the 1800s, we're breezing by here. In 1825, there was the first Norwegian group immigration to North America, and about 850,000 Norwegians came to the U.S. over the next 100 years, Minnesota receiving more Norwegians than any other state. Similarly to the Germans and the Swedes, most Norwegians came to the U.S. for economic reasons, for a better life. And there were several push-pull factors, one of those being Norway had a system of primogeniture. So the oldest son would receive the farm, and all of the remaining children would kind of have to make do. And there was an availability of land in the Midwest, particularly the upper Midwest, which made it an attractive area to settle. Norwegian immigrants often built churches before they built their own homes once they settled. That sense of community was important. And in the early years of settlement, there were often multiple Norwegian congregations in a small area due to differences in worship practices within the Lutheran faith, theological minutiae, and place of origin, where they came from in Norway. And as the 1800s went on, a lot of these congregations kind of dwindled, but some of them still remained. I actually just worked on a reference question the other day where there was probably 2 Norwegian Lutheran congregations, maybe a quarter of a mile from each other, so they're still around. And in 1847, the Missouri Synod was formed. It's now known as the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which is another national Lutheran church body like the ELCA. Even though Missouri is in their name, that's just where they started. They do have congregations across the country. And throughout much of the 19th century, Lutheran universities and seminaries were organized. So that would be universities and seminaries like Augsburg Seminary, St. Olaf College, Gettysburg Seminary, and the Lutheran Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. Okay, so this is just a map to illustrate where the bulk of Norwegian settlement was in the U.S. As you can see, Minnesota is the most populated, with some dense population around the Chicago area, southern Wisconsin, so Madison, and then northern North Dakota, and around the Seattle-Tacoma area as well. Okay, So in the 1900s, many of the smaller Lutheran organizations began to merge as regional differences became less significant over time. So the early 1900s saw many congregations deciding whether to change the languages of their services from their first languages to English. And then in the early 1960s and into the 1970s, the predecessors of the ELCA merged into the three larger church bodies. So again, that would be the American Lutheran Church, the TLCA, which was prominent in the Midwest, the Lutheran Church in America, or the LCA, which was prominent on the East Coast, and the Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches, the ELC, which split off from the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod in the 1970s. And then in 1987, these three organizations merged to form the ELCA. So the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod and another national Lutheran church body, the what's called the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod, or WELS, chose not to merge with the ELCA. So if you're looking for records of a Lutheran congregation and it's not in our database, it most likely belongs to one of these other two church bodies. So that was a very brief history of Lutheranism in the U.S. Moving on to what we have available for you. So we have a few print resources here that we use to help genealogists find more information on their ancestors who are Lutheran pastors. Unfortunately, these are not available online, but if you ever find yourself in the Chicago area, and you are welcome to come visit, I thought I'd tell you about them so you know what kinds of information we have here in case you are interested in learning more about your ancestor who. So we have some seminary records which contain quite a bit of information. If you have an ancestor who earned their degree at that seminary, we have records for 3 seminaries, specifically Gettysburg, Philadelphia, and Red Wing. So the first one would be Gettysburg Seminary, obviously in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It is now called United Lutheran Seminary, and it was organized in 1826. We have a list of alumni who graduated between 1826 and 1964, so we have a lot of data between those years. So that, for Gettysburg, it lists the birth date and place of each alum, their parents' names, their degrees and graduation dates, their dates and places where they served, the names of their spouse and children, and their death date. So it is a good bit of information. I pulled an example here. So this is the record for Charles T. Steck. And you'll see a lot of abbreviations here, but I can, myself or my other colleagues can help you kind of decipher this if you're having trouble. So he was born near Hughesville, Pennsylvania in 1836. It gives his parents' names, including his mother's maiden name. He was ordained in 1863 and soon became a chaplain in the Civil War. And then it lists the names and the years he served at different congregations between them. And then actually, he ended up leaving the Lutheran Church and became a pastor of the Episcopal Church in 1866, and then ended up returning to the Lutheran Church in 1874, which I found very interesting. And it also, near the end, lists his wife's name, the year they married, the names of their children, and then when he died, August 26, 1911. So each record is pretty much structured just like that. So we also have records for Philadelphia Seminary, which is in Philadelphia, also known as the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Philadelphia. It was organized in 1864. And similarly to Gettysburg, we have a biographical record that was published in 1923. So it has a list of faculty and alumni, and it lists their birth date and place, their parents' names, their degrees and graduation dates, the names of their spouse and children, and the places they served. We also have, last but not least, Red Wing Seminary. It was located in Red Wing, Minnesota, and it operated from 1879 to 1932. It was the educational...
Katie, can I
Sure.
interrupt you for a second?
Yes.
We're still seeing the slide for Charles Steck. Are you still on the same Charles Steck
Oh,
slide?
yes. Sorry, I didn't have another slide for the next two.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So, Red Wing Seminary was actually the educational center for what was called the ELCA, Evangelical Lutheran Synod in America, also Synod, and it lists the faculty and graduates from.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Katie. Can I interrupt you one more time? For some reason, I even though I've been turning up the volume on our side, you keep on kind of fading in and out. Is there a way maybe you could put the microphone a little closer to your mouth?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Is this better?
Much better. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry. My apologies. Okay. Do you need me to repeat any information?
I'll leave that up to the class. Anything you'd like repeated? Okay, yeah, I think we can just go ahead and continue, because I think when they watch the recording, they can turn up the volume at home. So that's okay. Go ahead.
Oh, sure. Okay, sorry about that. So the Red Wing Seminary records also list faculty and alumni, and it lists those that graduated from 1879 to about the 1920s. So it lists their education, profession, and where they served, where they were currently living at the time the record was published, which was about 1930, and their death date and burial. Okay, moving on. We also have something called the Lutheran Almanac. It contains quite a bit of information, and it's particularly helpful if you know your ancestor was a Lutheran pastor, but you're not quite sure where they served and where they lived and when they served. So we have almanacs from 1864 to about 1929, and in these almanacs, they contain a clerical roster. So it usually includes the pastor's name, as well as the town, county, and state they were serving in that the year the almanac was published. It occasionally includes which synod or church body as well. And some years it includes their address where they were living. Sometimes it is the address of the congregation, and sometimes it is the pastor's personal address, if that was separate from the parsonage that was attached to the congregation. The almanac also includes a section every year that lists the pastors who passed away that year. So, which usually has a good amount of information in it. Usually their name, the year they entered ministry or when they were ordained, their place of death, the age when they died, where they are buried, and their birth date and place. It's not always this descriptive, as you'll see with the records as we move on, but sometimes they are that descriptive. It kind of just depends on the year and who is publishing the almanac. So this is also helpful if you have a record like a baptism certificate. Oftentimes, I'm sure you've seen them, they have just the name of the child who is baptized, a lot of flowery language, the date, and then it's just signed by the pastor. It doesn't list where or which congregation they were baptized in. So if that's the case, you can contact us and say, hey, I have this certificate. It has the name of the pastor, but I don't know where it took place or what congregation. Can you help? We can, using the clerical roster, and see what town the pastor was serving in that year, and then we can use our congregational database and figure out what congregations were active at that time period. Also included in the Lutheran Almanac is a list of periodicals, so published by various Lutheran church bodies and organizations that year. It includes the name of the publications, which synod published it, and how often they were published, so weekly, bi-weekly, etc. And it's useful for finding out which periodicals were in circulation at the time. So like I mentioned before, we also have congregational histories. So as congregations from around the country celebrate milestone anniversaries, members or historical committees would write up a history of the congregation. And so several of these congregations' histories are here at our archives. Many of them wanted to donate a copy, which is very helpful. So the information typically included is obviously a history of the congregation, a list of the pastors who've served the congregation, pictures of various groups and church members over the years, and then sketches and photographs of the church buildings, both exterior and interior, which is pretty cool, like one of these pictures I have on the slide. So these are useful if you're interested in learning more about the congregation your ancestor was a part of. And these are also helpful if you have an ancestor who was a pastor at that congregation. So usually they'll include a little blurb about the pastor and his time serving that congregation. And it often offers a lot of personality and gives some more information that you wouldn't normally get from regular records about their time of service. So we also have biographical files. So these files are for pastors who served the ELCA and its predecessors. Most of these files we have are relatively more recent, mostly from the LCA and the TALC. So these are usually pastors who served during the 20th century up to present day. But we do have a few from the 19th century, although it's mostly 20th century. So the types of records typically included are the obituaries, the biographical records, and that includes information like the date and place of birth, their parents' names, the names of their spouse and children, the places they served and lived, and their degrees earned and their education. Some files also have photographs of the pastors, although that's a little bit more hit or miss. And occasionally there's correspondence, but not always, as you'll see with many other records. There are rarely any hard and fast rules. So moving on to digital resources, we have records of several congregations available on Ancestry for you to look at. So a little bit about the microfilm collection. There was a project launched in the 1970s and 1980s to microfilm congregational records such as parish registers and minutes. Not every congregation participated though. I would say maybe about half did, maybe a little bit less. It's hard to tell. And these collections were made available. We've had them for a long time. We've had the microfilm reels in our collections, but they were made available on Ancestry probably within the past 2 or 3 years. So there are 2 collections, one for...
I'm sorry, Katie. Katie, we have a question. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing that. I found some records in Wisconsin, which were the only records I had to prove a Mayflower descendant for the marriage of his ancestor and death of his ancestor were in the Lutheran church records.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. I'm glad it was helpful. Okay. So there are 2 collections available on Ancestry. They are called the U.S. Evangelical Lutheran Church in America Church Records, 1781 to 1969. There's another collection called U.S. Evangelical Lutheran Church in America Swedish American Church Records, 1800 to 1947. So the first collection is for congregations that belong to the TALC, the American Lutheran Church, and the second collection is mostly for congregations that belong to the Augustana Sittard, which was the Swedish Lutheran Church body. So if you go to the card catalog on Ancestry, you can either type in the exact name of the collection that I have on here, or if you just search Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, those 2 collections are the first 2 to pop up. So there are 2 ways you can find the collections. You can utilize the browse or the search functions. The search function is like any other on Ancestry. It's very, very easy to use. You can make it as specific or as minimal as you want. depending on your results that you're interested in finding. So the browse function is on the right hand of the screen when you're on the search page. I've included a screenshot of it on this slide. So I think the browse function can be more useful. As I'm sure you know, indexing can be hit or miss on Ancestry, and it doesn't always pick up everything. So if you know which congregation you're interested in looking at, this can be very helpful. You can pull up the congregation's records, you can browse through, look for the section you're interested in, and hopefully find the record you're looking for. So how to use the browse function, you'll see 3 drop-down bars like you see on the screenshot. So for the collection drop-down bar, you'll select congregational records. I believe the other option is pastoral acts. I don't think that pops up with anything that would be helpful. Congregational records is what you're looking for. And then you'll choose which state the congregation was in, and then the city or county. And then the names of the congregations that have records available will pop up at the bottom. And you can just click and it'll pull up the microfilm reel and you'll be able to click through each image. So for the Swedish congregation, or the Swedish collection, you'll only need to select the country, state, and town. You won't have to worry about this collection drop-down bar. So our collections on Ancestry are mostly comprised of parish registers, so these are most useful for genealogical research. So within the parish registers, there are several types of records, namely baptisms, confirmations, marriages, funerals, membership lists, minutes, and occasionally church history. As a side note, when genealogists are asked for baptism, marriage, or other types of records, the entry from the parish register is what we will have. It's what the regional archives will have. It's what the congregation will have. The certificates that were given at the time of the event are usually not available. Usually there's just one copy of it, and that was given to the family. Many of the parish registers, especially the older ones, are still in the first languages of its members. So Norwegian, Swedish, German, Danish, and Finnish are the most common for our collections. Often congregations didn't switch over to English until the turn of the century, sometimes even well into the 20th century. So next we'll go over the ministerial acts that are found in the parish register and the types of information that are typically included. So please keep in mind that the level of detail kind of varies between each congregation, how they chose to record their records. So while I'll provide kind of general overviews, it might not necessarily be the same for the records you're interested in. So the first record we'll go over, and I believe, Sue, you printed out the records?
Yes, they have both of your handouts.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so baptisms as a start. The types of information you'll find in a typical baptism record include the name of the child, their birth date, their baptism date, the names of their parents or guardians, the names of their witnesses or sponsors to the event. It could be family, it could be friends or neighbors. It doesn't list that typically in the record, but usually same last names will give you a clue. And sometimes they list the address or the place of residence. Sometimes immigrants were actually rebaptized once they came to the US. Either they couldn't provide proof of baptism in their hometown, so they were rebaptized when they came. Not always, but some pastors chose to do that. And sometimes children were baptized when they were 2 to 3 years old. So make sure to check the parish register a few years after you think the child was born. It might not necessarily be a few months after as we think of baptism today. So we have the first example of a baptism record. This is from Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Seattle, Washington. This was a historically Norwegian congregation. I've zoomed in a portion of the record. You'll see the whole page when you go into Ancestry. So this one, you get pretty lucky. You had someone kind of transcribe or translate the column headers for you. That's certainly not always the case. And I will point out there is a column on the far right side of the page that says information. Sometimes it says remarks. This is usually just kind of a catch-all notes column, and it's used just to record any other various information that column headers doesn't normally include. Okay, moving on to confirmations. The types of information that you'll find in a typical confirmation record, the name of the confirmed, the name of their parents, or sometimes just the name of the father, it depends, their birth date, their place of birth, and the confirmation date. I would say this record, more than others, varies in its level of specificity. Sometimes it'll just be the date of the confirmation. It'll just list the names of each member of the confirmation class. But sometimes it has all of these columns that you can find out wonderful information from. So most Lutherans were and are typically confirmed around 14 years of age, but I have also seen in the parish registers that adults were confirmed, sometimes at 22, sometimes at 25, sometimes at 40. It just depends. So just like the baptism records, I would say double check, go past a few years when you think they were 14, keep checking. They might be listed later on. So we have an example of a confirmation record here. This is from Peace Lutheran Church in Bessie, Oklahoma. It was a historically, I believe it's still active, German congregation. This record has more description than some. It actually is pretty detailed. It even includes which verse each confirmation member memorized. You'll see kind of second from the right, which is really neat. Adds a little bit of fun information. And this record only includes the father's name, not the mother's. Moving on to marriages. So the types of information typically included the names of the bride and the groom, the places of birth, the age they were when they were married, their marriage date, place of residence, the witnesses to the marriage, and their parents' name. So usually marriage and baptism records are your best bet for finding the names of your ancestors' parents, so the next generation farther back. So usually those are the most helpful. So we have here a marriage record from Grace Lutheran Church in New Orleans. I believe this was a historically German congregation, although I'm not entirely sure. It was a little difficult to tell. Our notes said it was, but there were some French names kind of filtering in there. So what I wanted to point out on this record, you'll see witnesses on the far right column, and most of them, the last names don't match. Either they were just neighbors, friends, sometimes coworkers. But then, except for the very bottom column and row, the bride's last name, either that's Rachel or Rochelle, I'm not quite sure, matches with a name in the witnesses column. So you might have a link there. So just keep an eye out for that when you're looking at the marriage records. We also have in Ancestry the funerals and death records. So the types of information included, the name of the deceased, their death date, their date of their funeral or burial, the age they were when they died, their place of death, and their place of burial. So for the most part, these records don't include the names of spouses or family members. Unfortunately, usually it's just the name of the deceased person. So while they're helpful, if you don't know that information, it's difficult to link to other family members just by using funeral records from a parish register. And usually cause of death is not included either. So we have an example of a burial record here. This is from Bethlehem Lutheran Church in Chicago. This was a historically Norwegian congregation. You'll notice, again, no family members are included. It's pretty bare bones. So this column for date of death includes 2 dates. You'll notice the pastor or whoever recorded this had 2 columns, one for the date they died and one for the date they were buried. They kind of made changes to the column because the parish register didn't quite include all the information that they wanted. And I'm not quite sure what it says under remarks. It might be the name of the pastor who performed the burial. Sometimes I do find that to be pretty common in burial records. And last but not least, we have membership lists. So it's exactly what it sounds like. These were lists of members of a congregation during a specific time period. So it lists the name of the member or members, the name of their parents, the dates they joined and left the congregation, and their death date. So these can be a good source of additional information not included in other records, especially if it's a Swedish parish register. Swedish records tend to be a little bit more detailed than others. So that's helpful. And usually membership lists are organized by family, sometimes alphabetically, or by date of entry, or sometimes in no apparent order. Can't really tell with it. So usually the head of the house will be first, followed by the names of their spouse and children, like in a census record. Single members are included as well, and unless the membership roll is listed alphabetically or by date of entry, families are listed first, and then single members are listed towards the back.
Katie, I have a question.
Sure.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just have a quick question.
No.
Now, the membership lists are self-explanatory, you know, that they were members of the church. But for the marriage records and the baptism records, did the people who were getting married or the people who were being baptized, did they have to be members first in order to get that?
No, they. Good. Yeah, good question. No, they did not. Oftentimes, you'll see, and I should have mentioned this, you'll see a column that'll say member at the top, and there'll either be a check for yes, they were a member, or just a blank for they were not a member. So no, kind of like today, you don't necessarily need to be a member of a church to be married there. Same was the case, and it was pretty common for non-members to be married in a congregation.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Oh, we have another question.
Oh, sure.
Removal. What does that?
The question is what does removal mean?
Oh, so that the pastor or whoever was creating the membership list would make a note of if a family or a member left the congregation. So if you know, sometimes that people move away, or sometimes they just decide they no longer wanted to be a member of that congregation. For their own records, the pastor would note the date they left. Does that help?
So not necessarily where they went to, just the fact that they left.
Correct. There are membership lists. Typically, I've seen them in Swedish membership lists that note the town or the congregation that they moved to. But I would say that's not super common, but it is a wonderful find if you do stumble upon that.
Thank you.
No problem. Oh, I also wanted to note that the date of the membership list was created is never super clear. It's not like sections of marriages in a parish register that'll say, you know, marriages from 1880 to 1881. Typically, membership lists are just started, and it's not really clear, like, oh, we started this membership list in 1932. So that is a little bit of an issue. And not every congregation had a membership list. I would say they're pretty common, and in most parish registers you'll find them, but it's not always the case. So the last example we have is from a membership list from Trinity Lutheran Church in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So you'll probably see this be the case with both most membership lists. There are a lot of edits, things scratched out. This one is organized alphabetically by last name. You'll see there is the column for name of father, but it wasn't really used. I think it was kind of used as a spillover from the column to the left. So the membership lists tend to be a little messier, sometimes a little harder to decipher because it was just a running list, so notes and changes were made as time went on. Okay. So we have some notes, tips, and issues that you might run across. So like I said before, you'll want to check probably 1 to 3 years past the year you believe the event happened. So for example, late entries were a thing. Say a marriage took place in 1933, but for some reason, and this happened occasionally, the pastor did not make a note of the marriage when it happened. Sometimes either they'll remember or do it later, and instead of going back to the 1933 list of marriages in the parish register, it's now 1935, they'll just enter the 1933 marriage in the middle of the 1935 marriages. So it makes it a little confusing. So I would say if you know they were married at a congregation or whatever the event was, and you know it was at that congregation and it was that year and they're not listed, I would suggest keep looking later on in the parish register. That might have been the case where it was noted later. So depending on the congregation, some parish registers have flags or targets when they were microfilming the parish register to mark the beginning of each ministerial act. So this is typically the case when the records are in a language other than English. It'll provide, for, let's say it's Norwegian parish register, dopta is the Norwegian word for baptism. And so there'll be a little piece of paper you'll see on the microfilm reel, and it'll say baptisms, just to let you know which section you're in. So as is the case, not every parish register will have these flags, and not every parish register will have what ministerial act it is listed at the top. So you'll have to pay attention as you're skimming through which section you're in. The records in Ancestry aren't always in order. Occasionally images are mixed up, and sometimes in parish registers, sections are split up. So there might be baptisms, confirmations, marriages, deaths from 1800 to 1890. It'll end. Then it'll be the same thing, baptisms, confirmations, marriages, burials from 1891 to 1900. So just because a section ends doesn't mean marriages aren't continued or baptisms aren't continued later on. So just make sure you check. Some images are also missing, I found to be the case. More often than not, we will have them on our own server here. So if you think that it's missing on Ancestry, please feel free to contact us, and I'd be happy to go look and find it for you. And then sometimes when the parish registers were being microfilmed, the page would move slightly, or the book would, whoever was microfilming accidentally bumped the parish register, shifting it a little, and kind of like in a photograph, it is blurry, makes all of the text blurry or faint. And sometimes the ink was just old and faded, so the microfilm scanner did not pick up the ink very well. So in this case, it is best to look at the or a better image of the original parish registers. So you can contact us, and I'd be happy to direct you to either the congregation or the regional archives, whichever has the original parish register. So this is just an example. You can see the left page is kind of in the process of turning, flipping over. The binding might have been tight. So it's very hard to read the left-hand side, even if you zoom. Sometimes if you zoom, you can kind of decipher, but in this case, even when I zoomed, could not read it. So some things to keep in mind when you're looking through the parish registers or searching for your ancestors, depending on their country of origin. Norwegian names. So there are a few rules. Norway had a patronymic naming system, meaning you would have your first name and your last name would be your father's first name plus daughter, or a spelling of son, sen. So for example, a man named Ola had a daughter Anna and a son Johan. Their full names would be Anna Olasdottir and Johan Olsen. So while they're siblings, they don't have the same last name. A third name was often used as well, which was usually a farm name, which signified a place of residence. And the farm name could change depending on if they moved in Norway. So typically, Norwegian immigrants either added the third name, which was usually the name of their last place of residence before they came to the U.S., or they removed the farm name altogether and just used their either, in this case, Olasdottir or Olsen as their last name. And even if the farm name was kept, often it was the case that it was modified or altered in its spelling. And so keep in mind also that the Norwegian government did not mandate the use of fixed family names, so meaning the same last name was used for everyone from generation to generation, until 1925. So that same practice carried over if people immigrated to the US before then. So like many other immigrants, Norwegians changed their first names as well, oftentimes to their English equivalents. In this case, I gave an example. Gure is a Norwegian name. I've seen it often changed to Julia. And in Norway, especially in rural areas, there were long-standing rules about naming descendants, which could have carried over to the US. So there was a rule, eldest son was named after his paternal grandfather. The second son was named after his maternal grandfather. And the same goes for daughters. So the eldest daughter was named after her paternal grandmother, and the second daughter was named after her maternal grandmother. If someone had more than 2 sons or 2 daughters, which is often the case, grandparents' names were already used. Children were then given their great-grandparents' names. Although it doesn't seem they were strict about the order, though. And of course, there were some special exceptions, which I provided later on a resource for Norwegian names, and they explain that in more depth. The Swedes and the Danes had very similar naming patterns to Norwegians. And something else to keep in mind when looking at Norwegian records, Norwegian congregation names often included the names of members' towns in Norway. So it could give you a good hint as to where they were originally from if they named their congregation after their hometown. So for German records, for German names, by the 19th century, Germans were giving their children 3 names, which you'll see oftentimes in the parish registers of German Lutheran congregations. And similar to Norwegians, the most common naming pattern for Germans was the same thing, eldest son named after the paternal grandfather, second son after the maternal grandfather, so on and so forth. But many people went by their middle names. So if you're looking in a parish register and you're skimming just the first names, I would say you might want to scan the second and third names as well, because while they had their first name, oftentimes they went by their second or third names, and that's the name you know from either family history or other records you found. So just watch out for that as well. And then don't be surprised if you're looking at a parish register and the column headings are in Fraktur, which is a little harder to decipher, but there are many online guides that can help you decipher that. And then a few tips. Provide, when you're contacting us, and I would say for other archives as well, provide as much relevant information as you can. Dates, places of residence, and name variations are incredibly helpful. I would especially say name variations that you've come across, because that can help kind of expand my search when I'm looking. If I know the various spellings, various iterations that your family name had. And even general ideas give us a good place to start. So while you might not know a specific year that someone was born, even if you have, like, they were born sometime in the 1880s, that can be really helpful. I would also say organize your information and relay it in a clear way. That always helps. And then if you contact a smaller congregation or regional archives, it might take a little bit of time to get back to you. Like I said before, many of the regional archivists are part-time, so they often have a lot of questions and not as much time as they would like to answer them within like a day or two. And smaller congregations, oftentimes it's just the pastor who's answering these questions, and they have a lot on their plate too. So I would just ask to have a little bit of patience as they're getting back to you. And I've included on the handout, but also on here, some other resources that I've found especially helpful in doing genealogy research. If you haven't already, or if you're not familiar with these, I'd advise you to kind of click around, explore. They have a lot of great information, and they've been really helpful. And then I have my contact information up here, and then also on your handout. I've included both my email and the general ELCA Archives email and the phone number. And then feel free to explore our website. And we also have 2 social media accounts, hopefully more coming soon. We have a Facebook page and a Flickr account, which has some wonderful images as well. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to take any more questions.
Okay, let me turn up the lights so you can see the class a little better. Okay, any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. How far back do these records go, and does it depend on what region these records are located in?
I would say probably early 1800s is most common. We do have some for congregations that were formed in the 1700s, although those are a little more rare. We certainly have congregations that were formed in the 1700s, but many of them have closed. And records are not as common for those congregations. So typically at the start of the 19th century is where you'll find the most records. Depending on region, I haven't found that to be the case. Almost every single congregation recorded in some form their members, what happened at their church. So I don't think it necessarily depends on region.
Another question? Yes, go ahead, speak loud.
In your experience, if immigrants may not have, when they came to the States, is there any particular place that you may be aware of you could direct for resources over in Europe?
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing.
Her question was, if the immigrant who came over that was Lutheran did not continue being Lutheran, is there a way to backtrack before they came over to America those records for them?
That is where it's a little farther out of my expertise. I focus mainly on when they come to the U.S. I would suggest continue searching for archives within their home country. I haven't been able to find a way to backtrack that. That's usually on the genealogist to do that. But yeah, sorry, I don't have more advice for that.
So there would not be an overseas Lutheran archive?
Not to my knowledge. I know there are large Lutheran Church bodies in different countries in Europe and actually across the world. But in terms of records for that church body and kind of in archives, that I'm not familiar with. I've just advised people to try to find which hometown their ancestors lived in and trying to find the congregations that were active in that hometown. So yeah, I'm not entirely sure.
Let me add a little something to that. Last year I was at the LDS Library in Salt Lake City, and I was able to find my Norwegian grandfather's farm. And once I found the farm name, it was very, very easy to backtrack, with that information. So it's not impossible, not at all impossible. And the reason I found the farm name was on the South Dakota baptism record of the child that was born here in America to that immigrant. And once I had that farm name, because obviously it was a name that didn't match his Americanized name, once I had that farm name, I just went to the LDS Library in Salt Lake City, and they had like a whole book on that farm, and I was able to like backtrack from there very, very, very easy, going back a couple hundred years. So, once you find, if it's a Norwegian, I don't know about Swedish or German, but if it's a Norwegian, if you find that farm name, very, very easy from that point.
Well, if they were royalty, might there be something, because there's so much in the public eye, there might, if I keep digging, probably find something because they would be.
Do you have a clue that it's royalty? Do you have a clue?
Some of them, yes, in the German world.
Okay, so I don't know if you heard that, Katie, but her question was is if it's royalty over, in Europe, would it be easy to track from there, or at least, you can track from there?
I would think so. In my experience, I haven't found anyone who has royal ancestors. It's mostly just been farmers. But I would think because they are more public figures that it would be easier to find information on them.
Another question?
Yeah, I have a question. For those people who are not going to use Ancestry and want to actually look at records, what does the cost, or is there a cost at these regional centers to do research?
A few regional archives do charge kind of hourly fees for research. I don't know off the top of my head which ones, but we have on our regional archives list available on our website the links to each regional archives, and you can click, and usually that information will be very easy to find on their website. I will say for us, we typically don't charge unless it's a very extensive question that will take us, more than a week to answer. Typically, we do it free of charge.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Because as we all know, genealogy can be very expensive.
Yes. Yeah.
More questions? Okay, I have a couple questions while they're thinking. For the people in the class that were not either converted into or raised Lutheran, could you explain confirmation?
Sure. So that is kind of, I will preface this that I was not raised Lutheran. I was raised Catholic. So, but Catholicism also has confirmation. So it's kind of a process that you go through, and I'm not sure of the differences between the whole process between Catholicism and Lutheranism. But it is a process you go through to become kind of an official adult or member of the church. I'm going to guess from that one record that part of it involves memorizing certain things and reciting them to kind of test your knowledge as you enter the church as an adult. And so you are just kind of seen as your own individual member rather than a child falling under your parents. within the church.
It also, I'll just kind of like add on to that. It also includes 3 years of basically instruction, about, like church and Bible studies, so to speak. So it's not just going into like adulthood. It's also the fact that you've been a learned member, up to that point in your life, and so you will become a better, more knowledgeable church member after the fact. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm still learning about Lutheranism.
The only reason I know that is because I was raised Lutheran and I went through 3 years of confirmation studies. So
yes.
Anyhow, so we have another question.
Yeah, I do. Here in the class, we have a resource. It's an early Lutheran baptism and marriage for southeastern Pennsylvania back in the 1700s. And I went through that because that's kind of my interest area for my family. And there were some things in it, and I wanted to ask you. You talked about naming, but I also saw that many of the children's names in baptisms, one of the people who was the sponsor had the same name as that child. I don't think they were maybe like grandparents or whatever, because they called them sponsors or this other name, Testes. It was TES that was written in there. And I guess it's like a godparent or whatever. But was that a common practice that you tried to find someone as your sponsor that had the same name, or did they name the children for the sponsors?
I would guess that while they might not be grandparents, they might be family members, and so they were named after, I don't know, maybe that was an aunt or an uncle or a cousin or sibling. I don't know if it was a common practice to name your child after their godparent, although I'm not entirely sure if Lutheranism there are godparents in particular. So yeah, I think that would be my answer to that. It might depend. It might be a regional. Certainly not everyone went by that rule.
More questions? Yeah, go ahead. Did you? Oh, you didn't. Okay. I have another question. Could you define synod once again for those who are not part of the Lutheran Church?
Yeah. So a synod is essentially, I'll explain it like this. So there are kind of 3 levels of organization within the ELCA. There is the churchwide assembly or churchwide organization. So that is the ELCA. I'll kind of say it at the top, but not really. It is just the national kind of governing organizational body. Then there are synods. So like the regional archives, there are synods, but there are 65 synods. So essentially it just breaks up the U.S., Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands into smaller areas that congregations are a part of. So the synods have their own bishop and supporting staff to kind of help manage congregational issues. They are in charge of the call process for if congregations are looking for a new pastor. So just think of a synod as a regional grouping of congregations.
Okay. And then I have another question. Do you have Lutheran Church cookbooks?
Oh, great question. I'm not sure off the top of my head. I'm still familiarizing myself with the collections, but I can certainly ask and get back to you.
As we all know, sometimes that's a really treasure trove of genealogical information. It could put your ancestor in a particular place at a particular time, and also clues to where else more records might reside. Not to mention, it's kind of cool to have your family's food culture history at the same time as your genealogy.
Yes, very true. I would say we probably wouldn't have too many of those here. I would say in terms of congregational specific records, we have what's available, what you can find on Ancestry, and then those congregational histories. I would say the more likely place to find things of kind of like a more personal nature, like a cookbook, would probably be at the regional archives or the congregations themselves.
Okay, and then you also mentioned early into your presentation the heavy concentration in Seattle, Tacoma. Now I understand, Minnesota, in that area, like you said, the Midwest. But what attracted the Lutherans to Seattle, Tacoma?
I'm not entirely sure. I did read a congregational history recently that the lumber industry was booming, so a lot of Norwegians may have moved there, as well as Germans, to kind of put their share into that industry. So that would be my guess. I'm not entirely certain off the top of my head. But yeah.
Oh, no, I think that's a great answer, actually. Wonderful answer. Because
good.
as we all know, immigration, frequently follows where the work is.
Yes.
Okay, and then if a person is not yet passed, can you still get the information? Like if they're a pastor, could you still get that information if they're still alive, or do they have to be deceased to get that information?
I would say usually we provide that information. We would kind of black out maybe. We would provide places they served and dates, but not their birth date or their home address, or kind of more personal, what we call PII, personal identifiable information. But I would say, yeah, we have done that in the past.
Okay. And then I asked about the cookbooks, but what about congregation newsletters?
We do have some of those. Oftentimes, those are tucked in the same boxes we have in the folders we have for congregational histories. So not only will those files have the congregational histories, but oftentimes there are event programs, there are newsletters in there, and they're actually really fun to read. So again, like the congregational histories, it might not be every single newsletter that was published. It was just, we have whatever someone chose to donate. So the congregation you're looking for might not have a newsletter, but I wouldn't say they're uncommon to find in our collection.
I'd just like to point out to the class, if you've never used congregational newsletters, don't overlook that, because they are literally chock full of just weekly events that went on in your ancestor's life. And I actually had a few ancestors that I actually broke through a tremendous amount of research on and found out a lot about their lives. And it just so happens these two particular ancestors of mine did never get married or have children. So their life story, there wasn't a lot to put into their life story. And if it had not been for those church bulletins and church newsletters that I was able to uncover, and I actually found them online through Internet Archive. I don't know, how often church newsletters and church bulletins end up getting published. I'm sure it has to do with, if there's somebody who has them who's willing to digitize them. But let me tell you, when you don't have a lot of information about your ancestor, if they, especially like I said, if they never got married and had children, those newsletters may be the only thing you're ever going to know other than their birth and death dates. So I encourage you, do not overlook that. Church records cannot be understated, or you really need to include them in your research. It's so important. Any other questions? Okay, I have one last question, Katie. Did I mispronounce your last name?
Oh no, it's Potempa.
Oh, good. Okay. And when I was doing the introduction, I kept on thinking, oh gosh, I hope I'm not messing up on your last name.
Oh no, that's okay.
Okay, and one last thing I wanted to point out, I think one of the best takeaways that I at least had from today's presentation is that tip that you gave about when you're looking for baptism records to go 2 to 3 years past the date you would expect the baptism to happen. Because, boy, let me tell you, it's especially like in the Lutheran faith, well, I imagine in all faiths probably, but, I know just more about Lutheran because I was raised Lutheran. It's really... you're shortchanging your research if you don't go further along looking for that record. And I can see why most people would not, because most people expect when there's a baptism for it to happen when the baby is an infant. So, that's a really great tip, and I can't thank you enough for that tip.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, it was something I realized quite quickly that when you're doing genealogy, you need to kind of have a certain tenacity to stick with the research and not give up if it doesn't appear right away when you think an event should be recorded. So yeah, definitely I would say keep looking, keep searching through those parish registers if you know for a fact that your ancestor was baptized or confirmed, so on at that congregation.
Okay, excellent. So one last question, one last chance. Anybody have any last questions? Is there any problem if they reach out to you directly if they think of a question or need help after the fact?
Oh, no, absolutely. You're more than welcome to send me an email, either at the archives email account or my own email, or if you prefer to call, be happy to talk to you. Yeah, any question you have or you need any additional help, I'm happy to do that for you.
All right, wonderful. And thank you also for giving us permission to record today. So, if there's anything that they missed out on, they can watch it again. So we really thank you for that as well.
Oh, no problem.
Okay, let's give her a big hand, shall we?